When is a storeroom more than a storeroom? This is not a riddle. It's a vital element in today's episode from the book of Nehemiah, one of the more obscure books of the Bible. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, January 26th, 2022. Jerusalem's walls have been rebuilt. Yay! And they've had an appropriate service of dedication. Yay again! At this stage of the game, Nehemiah felt it was time he could return to Persia, where he was still an officer in the court of Artaxerxes. You may recall that he had asked permission of Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem to look into some problems that he'd heard about. Now, some 12 years later, with his work pretty well completed, he returns to Artaxerxes. But you know the old saw. When the cat's away, the mice will play. Nehemiah seems to have believed that when he was leaving, everything was in good order. But when he returned to Jerusalem sometime later, he found that things had gone seriously off the rails. Here's the story. You'll recall in yesterday's reading, Nehemiah describes the storerooms for the temple goods, food for the priests and the Levites and so on. This seemed like a rather mundane thing to mention as part of the service of dedication of the walls of Jerusalem. But it is these storerooms that now come into play once again. The way Nehemiah tells the story is a little convoluted, but the gist of it is that before he left, the people heard one of the readings from the law which concerned a story in the book of Numbers, a story concerning the prophet Balaam, who refused to curse Israel on behalf of the Moabite king Balak. The upshot of this story from Numbers for Nehemiah was that no Ammonite or Moabite would ever be acceptable within Israel. Why is this important? Because one of the priests serving in Jerusalem, a man named Eliashib, who was charged with the oversight of these storerooms, also happened to be the son-in-law of Tobiah, whom we've encountered before. Tobiah was one of the governors of the surrounding area, and he was an Ammonite. Here's where the story gets interesting. Eliashib cleared out the storerooms and placed furniture in those rooms for his father-in-law, Tobiah. Nehemiah reports, "Now before this, the priest Eliashib, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large room where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes I went to the king." So now, Nehemiah makes sure we know that the Ammonites and Moabites had been singled out for specific exclusion from the company of Israel. But here is one of the priests making room among the supplies in the temple for an Ammonite. When this was happening, Nehemiah was away, of course. And so when he returned from his visit to Artaxerxes, he wasted no time setting things right once again. After some time, I asked leave of the king and returned to Jerusalem. I then discovered the wrong that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah, preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the room. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. Now, this may sound harsh to you and me. We profess an openness to all people to come into the church without exception. Throwing someone out and cleansing the spaces where they had been just isn't in our spiritual DNA. But once again, I go back to the idea that Israel was called to be a distinct people for the purpose of being a blessing to the world. One of the things they had to do to ensure their distinctiveness was to maintain the integrity of their worship practices, And having an Ammonite living in the very storerooms of the temple was a threat to their distinctiveness and to their integrity as a people. Because remember, part of the reason they'd been exiled in the first place was that their worship practices had become mixed with the practices of other nations. While, again, this might sound harsh, and while we maintain an openness in a way that Israel simply couldn't, we also still need to maintain our distinctive witness as Christian people, because our mission is the same nonetheless. We're to be a blessing for all the families of the earth. Tomorrow, we take one last look at Nehemiah before we move on to other things. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.